we'll get the readout as well from Dr. Bates Gill, a prominent American international relations scholar and China specialist. He is Senior Fellow for Asian Security at the National Bureau of Asian Research and the author of Daring to Struggle, China's Global Ambitions under Xi Jinping. Welcome to France 24, Dr. Gill. Let's start with your take and your takeaway from this summit. There was talk of the 3 T's being discussed: tariffs, Tehran, Taiwan. What do you think's changed in the dynamic since Wednesday?
The sense of who sort of came away from the summit with the most valuable outcomes. I think that's China. I mean, China, I think, achieved its goals here, and that was to have a very high-profile summit, to rain lots of praise and respect towards President Trump, to give him a sort of happy and beneficial lot of pomp and circumstance, and that's what happened. In terms of actual outcomes, though, and takeaways that the United States can claim were valuable, I think they're still sparse. And in basically both readouts from both the United States and China basically say that there's more to be discussed, more specifics later. And I think we have to conclude that that's basically where we are at this point. We have to wait and see.
You were listening, Doug, just listening to Dr. Gill. You were listening to the press conference on the plane. We've listened to it back and some of the Brett Bauer interview as well. Just tell me about the comments on Taiwan. Will Beijing be pleased with that?
Will Beijing be pleased with that? I mean, basically, we haven't heard anything. We had no real pushback from Donald Trump. It's amazing with Donald Trump because, he famously will tweet against, will go on, these bashing social media binges against any leader who really puts him in a position that might potentially make him look awkward or let alone embarrassed or humiliated. And in this case, you have a Chinese leader, arguably, right now the second most powerful leader in the world, the U.S.'s arch strategic rival right now, not so bluntly, in fact, pretty emphatically, sending a message on the very first day of the summit that Taiwan is the most important issue in U.S.-China relations, that if there is going to be conflict, it could come from a mismanagement of the Taiwan issue. Essentially, a shot across the bow to Donald Trump saying, watch out on Taiwan, putting it front and center. And the fact that you have Trump, who, just last week, I think he set a new record. I think he posted on social media on 55 times in 3 hours, yet there was no real pushback. And on the contrary, you had Trump lavishing and showering Xi Jinping with praise as a great leader. You could forgive the casual observer for saying that comes across as, if not a little timid and groveling, at least as a little obsequious. So if you're asking, who had the upper hand, who has the cards here, Donald Trump's very rhetoric and behavior in the face of what was a very clear emphatic statement on one of the biggest issues, one that China says is the biggest issue, Taiwan, is a big deal. And I'll just say, the Chinese public, right, they're awash in their state-controlled media and the propaganda that it showers on them. They came in, they approached this summit. You see the Chinese press, right, convinced that the U.S. is a declining empire that is bent on stopping China's rise.
It's a hot country, apparently, she said.
And so I would highly suspect what's interesting is the takeaway here is it's not just the Chinese who have that perception of America, by and large, as a declining power bent on stopping China's rise. You probably have a fair number of Americans right now who come away with an impression that whether they like Xi or not, whether they are, for China's success or not, or rise on the world stage, they can't help but see that Xi Jinping seemed to be much more stilly-willed and consistent than Donald Trump in communicating and projecting his message throughout the 2 days. It was a short summit of this meeting.
It's a very interesting point. I just want to raise that with you as well, actually, Dr. Gill, because just on the exact quote on Taiwan that he mentioned to Fox News, he said this: we are not looking at somebody saying, let's go independent because the United States is backing us. Does he still remain within the realms of what the US administration want, which is strategic ambiguity? How do you read it?
Yeah, that's Donald Trump's own way of garbling, but still nevertheless delivering what I would say is still a consistent message that the United States does not support Taiwan independence. That's been consistent for decades. But the way Donald Trump said it and the way that he sort of engages with the press, as well as I suspect even with his engagement with President Xi. I think he's leaving wiggle room, which is sort of his typical approaches to negotiation, leaving some daylight that things could change. On that press gaggle on Air Force One, he said a couple of things that I thought were also quite interesting, saying, for example, that the so-called six assurances, which is a Reagan-era set of pledges on the part of the United States towards Taiwan, including one of them being that there be no negotiations or discussions with the Chinese side about arms sales to Taiwan. He went as far as to say to the press, at least, that that's basically said that's a Reagan-era pledge, implying that it may no longer be the case. He also said that as part of his deliberations about this, $12 or $14 billion arms package that may or may not go to Taiwan, he said he's going to have to talk to, and then he couldn't name the person, you know what I mean, the leader of Taiwan. So all of this suggests that President Xi was able to deliver this strong message to President Trump, and he apparently has taken the bait and is now willing to at least say that there may be some change or reconsideration of relations with Taiwan.
Very interesting. Doug, you wanted to come in.
Well, I'm just saying, and also the elephant in the room, the context here being Donald Trump going into this summit, not in the posture he would have wanted, in the midst of an Iran war, which perhaps he thought would have been done and dusted in a few days, the same way Vladimir Putin thought that his invasion against Ukraine was going to be over relatively quickly. No, 10 weeks later, it's still going on, and he arrived at this summit in if not a diminished posture, at least a little bit on the defensive, desperately needing China's help. Whether he acknowledges it or not, and he doesn't really acknowledge it, in trying to inveigh upon Iran to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. And that is not a little minor point, because it weighed over the entire summit, even if it wasn't a giant part of the final readouts. And I'll just note, you can't also ignore the fact that, this war has drained the resources away from that so-called Asian pivot and away from the Asian-Pacific region, back into another Mideast war. Donald Trump's obviously cognizant of that, as is his defense secretary, even if they're still giving gung-ho press conferences about how their military might is unwavering and undiminished. The fact of the matter is, and Xi Jinping knows it, there's some key weapons in the Pentagon arsenal, is diminished, is dwindling, will need to be reproduced, and that will take some time. And that time is on Xi Jinping's side here. If he were eyeing some sort of forceful takeover of Taiwan, some analysts say, within the next year, as early as 2027, he knows that the U.S. Might not right now be at the top of its game militarily to be able to fight a war on two fronts. That's obviously assuming the Iran war is still going, but even if it isn't.
To that point, if we go back, I think it was San Francisco in the sidelines of a summit on APEC, 2020, just a few years ago, 2021, I think, between Biden and Xi. They had sort of 4 hours on the sidelines. And that came up, the idea of sort of U.S. position on China and whether China would take Taiwan by 2027, 2035. Dr. Gill, I think I'm right in saying that President Xi made clear that nobody in his team had said that was ever going to be the case. So again, he kept a strategic ambiguity around that. And it's worth saying to Doug's point as well, isn't it? President Trump will also be aware that China's military is not what it should be right now.
Yes, the 2027 meme, I think, is overplayed, over-exaggerated. I don't think China wants to use force. I mean, I think they have even more confidence today, coming out of the summit, that they can achieve the aims they wish vis-a-vis Taiwan without having to fire a shot, which of course would be their uppermost preference. And if anything, I would think they feel even more strongly that that's still possible. And you're right. Obviously, a lack of confidence in the military leadership these days in China, reflected in the massive purges of all the senior-most military leaders, especially those with any military experience, I should say warfighting experience whatsoever, has to give some pause to Xi when if and as he wants to contemplate a potential military solution. I don't think he needs to, at least not at this point. And the summit, I don't think, changes that and might even reinforce their confidence that time is on their side.
Bates, stay with us. Doug, I want to bring you back in at this point, because one takeaway, perhaps an easier win to say for President Trump, were what they talk about, the three Bs: beef, beans and Boeing. Now, what we were used to here is a very different President Trump in terms of what he was prepared to say on things in China than he's told reporters on the plane. Yeah. Perhaps you might say that was natural. It was deference perhaps to the Chinese leader. But he's talking up success. But that's not what the stock market's saying on Boeing.
It's not what they know. The Boeing stock went down initially, over 4%, 4.5%, I think, slightly recovered, then went down a little more. There was at least Trump, his administration mentioning the figures of an agreement for 200 purchases of Boeing aircraft. You might say, well, that doesn't sound too bad. That's dozens of aircraft. It would be the biggest purchase of a Chinese purchase of an American plane maker in many, many years. I think over a decade. But yet for Boeing, it disappointed the markets. It disappointed the company itself, because they had perhaps been expecting a much larger figure out there. And Donald Trump himself seemed to suggest that there had been some general consensus, although this was not corroborated in anything but from Beijing, either the foreign ministry or in its own readout, for some future prospect of China to buy up to 750 Boeing planes. But like I said, this is all coming from the American side. We don't have specific details on what was actually agreed. And when you look at what the Chinese are saying, it's much vaguer, and it talks mainly in terms of a good consensus on general stability and economic cooperation, efforts at economic cooperation going forward. So it's that disparity in sort of Trump, like you said, trying to talk up a hot success coming out of this summit on that economic front and the deal making, and the Chinese being much more opaque, if not completely, completely hard to read.
Hard to read. Dr. Gill, just give us a thought on perhaps Beijing and those around Xi will be making of this today. Because let's go back a few years. I mentioned the meeting with President Biden and Xi at the time. Let's also talk about, under the Biden administration, Secretary of State Antony Blinken had this infamously fiery diplomatic meeting with his opposite number, I think 2023 in Alaska. He listed human rights abuses, the situation in Hong Kong, Taiwan, and then the Chinese official cited America's democracy problems, the targeting of migrants. He called it condescension. He was talking basically at each other, grandstanding for a while. They were void of talk of human rights. We have just heard President Trump tell reporters he raised the issue of Jimmy Lai, and that it was being considered, he said, by President Xi. That on top of the fact that yesterday we had this moment where President Xi talked of the what he called the Thucydides trap, where he quoted the great Greek historian on the 5th century Peloponnesian, a war between Sparta, the superpower then, and the Athens that was the up-and-coming upstart crow in that. He was kind of letting him know, wasn't he? I know you see us, and let's not be hasty here. What's your take?
Well, first of all, I think what we're seeing here is the classic dynamic in high power, high profile summitry between the United States and China that's been going on for decades. That is, China wishes to seek the overall strategic parameters of the relationship. You might want to call it vague or opaque. It's not. It's just an effort to try to set the terms of the relationship going forward, the foundation for the relationship, which the phraseology coming out of Beijing loud and clear is constructive strategic stability. That's what China wants the United States to agree to, and claims in their readouts that Donald Trump did agree to that framing of the relationship. The American side, in contrast, likes to show that there have been concrete outcomes. Trade deals, opening of investment, opportunities for American business, so on, a Jimmy Lai release, those sorts of concrete deliverables. So that's just a classic dynamic, and we're seeing it being played out now. I think we just have to wait and see where they meet in the middle. And on the comment that you made about the changes here in relation especially to how the United States wishes to confront China on certain key topics like human rights, treatments of Uyghurs in Xinjiang, or the future of Taiwan, it's very clear that much of that has been swept off of the agenda. The Chinese are very keen to see that those issues get removed from the dynamic, and it seems as if that has been the case in this particular instance. Not really a word at all about the human rights situation in China, the treatment of Uyghurs or Tibetans. Very vague on the U.S. side about what the future of Taiwan may be in terms of American support for it. So while the overall dynamic, I think, is still the same, China wanting to set the strategic terms, the United States wanting to have certain deals, and of course, the underlying dynamic of tension, miscommunication, different takes on what actually came out of the summit. It just tells me that we have plus ça change. We have the same sorts of problems here going forward, and I don't see a lot of long-term stability being achieved coming out of this summit.
The terms cannon kicked and road possibly coming up again in September. Great to have you on the programme, Dr. Gill. Really good to talk to you tonight.
Thank you.
Dr. Bates Gill, prominent American international relations scholar, as you saw there, with the book behind as well, the author of the renowned Daring to Struggle, China's Global Ambitions under Xi Jinping. Now, there's been a lot resting on whether President Trump could influence President Xi to lean on the Iranian regime to open the Strait of Hormuz. President Trump said before the visit he didn't need to ask China for help. We heard a moment ago that he told Fox News during the summit he'd asked for China's help. On the plane back, both he and Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, told the press they don't need China to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. For context, 80% of Iran's oil exports go to China. That's 30% of China's oil coming from Iran. There's also the lesser-mentioned resource, the so-called king of chemicals, that's hardest hit right now. This is sulphuric acid. More than half of fertilisers around the world produced with sulphuric acid, used for farming, mining, metals. It's used for leaching copper, nickel, cobalt, zinc, as well as for oil refining and wastewater treatment. Right now, Chile, Indonesia and the DRC are badly affected. The imports come from the Gulf and China, and since the closure of the strait, Beijing has put in place export restrictions. Freda Gordon is in London. She's the director and co-founder of Acuity Commodities, which tracks global sulphuric acid markets. Let's try and understand, this clearly wasn't as high on the agenda, but Freda, it's great to have you on the programme tonight. For us, outline to us how high on the agenda you were hoping the issue would be. There's no public announcement yet that anything was agreed there.
No, I really think that ultimately, as long as the Strait of Hormuz is still effectively closed, then there won't be any change in terms of like export restrictions for sulphuric acid at all. So if there were any positive progress on that, then that will help us. But if the strait is still closed, you still have effectively more than half of the global seaborne traded sulphur still stuck. And really, it's all about food security, right? The reason why people, or why China is restricting the export of sulphuric acid is because they fear that there is not enough raw materials for the production of fertilizers within China. And ultimately, in terms of food security, you would want enough fertilizers in your land, sold to farmers at a reasonable price. It's as simple as that.
That was exactly what I was going to ask you, actually. It's a good point, because the question to why does China need to place export restrictions right now, what you're saying is that there is a threat. It might produce so much, but there is a threat, or it fears a threat to its own supply.
Indeed, indeed. So what China is doing, or has been doing, is that they need a supply guarantee. Number one, supply guarantee of fertilizers to farmers. That's why they're already restricting exports of certain fertilizers out of China. And the second thing is the supply guarantee of raw materials for the production of fertilizers, which means they need to do something about sulfur and sulphuric acid, as you mentioned, being the two raw materials for fertilizers. They, first off, with sulfur, they make sure that some of the oil refineries in China are selling sulfur to key fertilizer producers at preferential prices. And to give you an example, looking at today's prices, that preferential rate is about 75% cheaper than the current spot price of sulfur. So that really helps farmers because the input cost of fertilizers will be lower. And for sulphuric acid, is, as you mentioned, restrict the exports of it, keeping all the sulphuric acid, and have them go to fertilizer production.
So when it comes to the markets, to the price of sulphuric acid, I guess ultimately we're going to see down the line how it will affect farmers, food, mining as well. But just tell us, give us an idea of what it was before the conflict, what it is now, and what downstream effect that's having.
Well, right before the war, I would just give you a number, let's say CFR China, which is like the delivered sulfur price to China. Right before the war, we were talking about 500, which was higher than historical levels. And that's really because of more and more demand for sulfur. Like you mentioned, EV batteries is becoming very important. So these guys who are making cobalt, copper, nickel, they are increasingly buying sulfur. So that pushed the price up. But anyways, that was before the war, 500. 1,500-ish CFR in dollars. Now we're talking about 1,000, 1,200. Some people are expecting maybe $1,300 CFR could be achieved, for example, in India. So that's a really significant increase. It's over 100% in just more than 2 weeks, 2 months.
Given that nothing has come out of this summit so far that we're aware of, where do you see this going? I mentioned the DRC, I mentioned Latin America, Chile, Indonesia as well. To what extent are we going to see those countries on the front line affected?
They definitely have to cut back on their productions now because, like you said, king of chemicals, it goes into so many different downstream products. But I think a lot of the countries are more concerned about food security. So fertilizers is something that we're watching. A lot of the fertilizer producers have already announced they're cutting back their production rates. Is either because of the lack of sulphur or high price of sulphur or lack of other products. So Morocco is been down, running at fertilizer production rate at 70% since April. US Mosaic just announced that beginning this month, they're going to cut back some of the production rates in their Florida sites. China has already been running at reduced rates, India as well, Brazil as well. You mentioned DRC, Copperbelt. Interestingly, I think they have had enough stocks of sulfur right before the war, so I haven't heard of major production cuts yet. But essentially, most of the sulfur consumers, it's safe to say that they like to keep 1 to 2 months of stocks as kind of like a rule of thumb. And the war is into its 11th week, going into 12. So I think if the Strait of Hormuz remains effectively closed for another month, you will see more and more shutdowns. And that's going to hit fertilizer producers, like we said, copper producers, copper producers, and a lot of the industrial chemical producers as well.
Freda, good to talk to you. A fairly bleak assessment, but good to have some context and clarity. Freda Gordon, the director of the co-founder of Acuity Commodities, as I say, which tracks sulphur and sulphuric acid markets. As we both said, dubbed the king of chemicals for the reasons just explained. Thank you, Freda.